It's within the Islamic house. It's affiliated with Islamic nonsense. It's not even suitable for animals. And honestly, I don't allow myself to go down to this level to discuss this matter. But unfortunately, you don't have the knowledge. You haven't lived it.
But here's a typically good passage, I think, from the Satanic Verses. Salman the Persian is the name of the man who's taking down the dictation from the Muhammad figure. And Rushdie writes about the man, Salman, who's taking down all this dictation. He says, Salman the Persian finds the Prophet spouting rules, 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 rules. Rules about every damn thing. If a man farts, let him turn his face to the wind. A rule about which hand to use for the purpose of cleaning one's behind. It was as if no aspect of human existence was to be left unregulated or free. The rules flow, they include dietary laws, the way in which to kill an animal, and the way in which you can have sexual intercourse. And eventually, at one point, Salman the Persian starts to wonder about the origin of this revelation. He says, what manner of God this was that sounded so much like a businessman. And then he says, but of course Muhammad himself had been a businessman, and a damned successful one at that.
From Saudi's progressive driving laws to Britain's shadow courts, watch as Mosab Hassan Yousef, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Douglas Murray dissect how Islamic law collides with modern democracy. From medieval rules in modern capitals to the myth of religious democracy, these experts expose why you can't vote on divine commands, the gap between peaceful Muslims and problematic texts. It's not what you think. Buckle up for some uncomfortable truths about Islam's struggle with secular freedom.
Second, in principle, the Islamic Sharia or Shura or whatever we are concerned about is only for men. Look at all the Islamic councils or Shura councils, movements, organizations, even if it exists in governments. Where are the women? You know? This is inspired by one event before the death of Muhammad, the founder and the prophet of Islam, when he asked his friends, all of them were men, about a couple of issues. And there were no women, only men, which means that 50% of the society is out of this. How can we call that democracy? You know, this is like the Vatican's vote, you know, for who's going to be the next pope. And we call that this is democracy. It's within the Islamic house. It's affiliated with Islamic nonsense. It's not even suitable for animals. And honestly, I don't allow myself to go down to this level to discuss this matter. But unfortunately, you don't have the knowledge. You haven't lived it. And what really feel sorry for people who spend time studying the thing. And it's like a rabbit hole, you know, going into this hole and to other hole does not have an end to it. Islam is not going to take over. And it cannot replace democracy.
Democracy? Islamic style, Saudi Arabia finally let women drive in 2018. How progressive. In Iran, women comprise 3% of parliament while needing male permission to travel. Afghanistan's Taliban banned women from universities entirely. Kuwait gives women half a man's testimony in court. Qatar requires male guardian approval for marriage at any age. But hey, at least they let women watch soccer games now from segregated sections.
And we should not be afraid of it. We should honestly laugh at it. Because it's just a bunch of stupid ideas that did not work in the 7th century and are not going to work for the 21st century. Trust me. And thank you for listening, and thank you for staying with us tonight.
Douglas, how far have we went down to the rabbit hole?
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back. Let me just give an example of where this subject hits the road in a country in Europe. Because in Britain, we've been going through a bit of this discussion for some years now. It's just over a decade since the Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK, former Archbishop of Canterbury now, Rowan Williams, gave a speech in London that was delivered with his normal style, which was a style that very silly people think is clever. And people left the room saying, wasn't that brilliant? Because they didn't really know what he'd said. And when they actually did work it out, it seemed that he had made this comment, which he had made, about Sharia law having to have a place in Britain in the future. And he was asked about it the next day on the radio, and he got himself into a much bigger problem because he made this point absolutely clearly, and he was forced to by the interviewer, and he said, yes, there should be a place for Sharia law in the future in Britain. And it was a very interesting period because there was a massive backlash against the Archbishop. Furious backlash, I think, in the papers and in the public square.
Ah yes, 2008, when Archbishop Williams suggested Sharia law was inevitable in Britain. Now London has 100+ Sharia councils where women routinely receive half their brother's inheritance and can't divorce abusive husbands. Birmingham's Crown Court just handled an honour-killing case, while local Sharia courts justified domestic violence. Is this the unavoidable multicultural enrichment the Archbishop envisioned? Spot the peaceful coexistence.
And there were several different debates going on, actually. The first one was that part of the public heard him saying there should be a future for Sharia in the UK, and they thought, my God, the Archbishop of Canterbury is pro-beheadings in Trafalgar Square, which seemed extreme for the Church of England, and was not a good way to get the people on side. But that's what part of them heard. In actual fact, to do him justice, and there's no particular reason to do him justice, but to do him justice, that was not what the Archbishop was arguing. What he seemed to be saying was that there is, that just as the churches can have their own administrative arbitrational bodies, so in the future Muslims should have theirs, and that this was what he was meant. He was not pro-beheading, he was pro something of Sharia in British life, and that if you have very large Muslim populations such as we have in the UK, that was basically a statement of the obvious, that Sharia was going to have a place. What was interesting about this is it was another one of the set of very swift learning curves, which I think every country has been on in recent decades when they've had to come across these issues. I've often asked in the UK, did anybody until Valentine's Day 1989 know what a fatwa was, or that it could be issued, or what it might be issued over? I've never found any politician in Britain who advocated migration and mass migration saying, oh, at some point some of our novelists will be murdered, but, you know, take the rough with the smooth. And no one ever did say that. They never saw it coming. Just like we never saw coming that cartoons in Scandinavia would be a huge issue suddenly, and that embassies would be burned around the world and so on. And the Archbishop's comments just over a decade ago were another very swift learning curve, because suddenly everyone tried to find out, what is this thing, the Sharia law that's going on?
Pre-1989, fatwa wasn't in British vocabulary. Then Rushdie happened, embassies burned, translators murdered, publishers firebombed. Now we've got British-born jihadists, honour killings in Bradford, and Charlie Hebdo massacre survivors in hiding. Politicians who championed mass migration never mentioned death for blasphemy in their diversity brochures. Funny how cultural enrichment works differently in practice than theory.
And what was interesting was that the discovery, I think, that the public made was at the same time horrifying and slightly less horrifying than they first thought. The horrifying bit was, yes, there were some dozens, now scores of Sharia courts operating in the UK, but, and this is quite an important detail, they were able to operate and are able to operate in the UK because of an Arbitration Act, which exists in British law, which allows two parties to volunteer for an arbitration, and that so long as the arbitration is judged, and it can be judged in a Sharia court, or in a liturgical court, or indeed there's one case of biker gangs, where there was an arbitration between two biker gangs, and that this was able to be arbitrated under the law of the land. And this is the crucial thing, is that so long as the judgment of the court, whatever type of court it is, does not contravene British law, it's permitted. So you couldn't...
So they can actually choose between the jurisdiction?
No. Crucially, yes, you can choose the arbitration court, but you cannot, the court itself cannot supersede British law. So, for instance, it could be a family dispute, a marital dispute, possibly. The details matter. Divorce, it could be an issue, as there's one case of the dispersal of a will of a Muslim man who died without leaving clear indications of how he wanted his estate divested. And so long as, so the court, the Sharia court would not be allowed to say the wife must be killed. The British law would not say, fine, that's the judgment of the Sharia court, or anything like it. But the court, so long as the judgment didn't go against British law, would be allowed. And this was a very interesting bit of the learning curve on this, was that we discovered again the difference between the stated law and practice.
British law's arbitration loophole lets Sharia courts operate under voluntary arbitration rules, theoretically subject to UK law. Reality, women pressured to accept unfair divorce settlements, inheritance disputes resolved by 7th century rules, domestic abuse cases mediated through religious lens.
And this is what gets so difficult, because the British attitude was, well, as long as the arbitration tribunals don't do anything that supersedes the law of the land, we're not going to step in. But then the questions begin. For instance, how is the Sharia court going to disperse the will of the dead Muslim man other than in accordance with Sharia? And the Sharia is not going to be in accordance with the Human Rights Act and the idea we have in Britain of, for instance, the equality of the sexes. And so it turns out that in that particular case, the judgment is that the daughters of the man get half the money of the brothers because they are women. And then you get the cases where the government has, in my view, in my observation, I've spoken to quite a lot of people who've been under these arbitrations, has no way of knowing, for instance, if the woman has genuinely volunteered for the arbitration or not. It's exceptionally hard to decide, and indeed whether she has voluntarily accepted the judgment of the court or not. So this is, I just offer this in a way of perhaps interesting comment about how this lands in a country in Europe. One other thing, if I may, just before, since I mentioned at the beginning I referred to the Rushdie affair, which of course Dr. Pipes wrote a book on around the time, wasn't it? One thing that struck me, has often struck me about that, is that the Satanic Verse is known as an affair, but very little as a novel, and I'm quite an exponent of it as a novel. Most people don't make their way through it, but it has some terrific passages, and I just wanted to, because you don't get readings from the Satanic Verses often enough, and if you can't do it in Budapest, I don't know where you can.
The inheritance case perfectly illustrates the problem. Daughters getting half their brother's share under Sharia, while British law mandates equal treatment. How voluntary is arbitration when community pressure and family coercion exist? Government can't verify, consent, or monitor outcomes. This creates a shadow legal system where women's rights vanish behind closed doors.
But here's a typically good passage, I think, from the Satanic Verses. Salman the Persian is the name of the man who's taking down the dictation from the Muhammad figure. And Rushdie writes about the man, Salman, who's taking down all this dictation. He says, Salman the Persian finds the prophet spouting rules about every damn thing. If a man farts, let him turn his face to the wind. A rule about which hand to use for the purpose of cleaning one's behind. It was as if no aspect of human existence was to be left unregulated or free. The rules flow, they include dietary laws, the way in which to kill an animal, and the way in which you can have sexual intercourse. And eventually, at one point, Salman the Persian starts to wonder about the origin of this revelation. He says, what manner of God this was that sounded so much like a businessman. And then he says, but of course Muhammad himself had been a businessman, and a damned successful one at that. A person to whom organization and rules came naturally. So how excessively convenient it was that he should have come up with such a very business-like archangel who handed down the management decisions of this highly corporate, if non-corporeal God.
I would ask Ayan about some apologists of the Sharia. I was surprised to see that there are a few, quite a few, and they are actually referring to the Quran as a democratic source. They are saying that in the Quran there is the so-called provision of the Shura, which is the provision and requirement of consultation.
Religious democracy is an oxymoron when every bodily function needs divine permission. Islam's 6,236 Quranic verses plus thousands of hadiths micromanage everything from bathroom etiquette to bedroom behavior. This isn't spirituality, it's totalitarian control, masquerading as religion. When God becomes CEO and Gabriel middle management, there's no room for democratic choice.
In the Quran, which means that it is obligatory for Muslims in managing their political affairs to engage in mutual consultation. And from that, derived from that, I have a question if there is at all a concept like a religious democracy.
When you put the question that way, is there such a concept as religious democracy? It sounds as if you want me to answer on all religions, which obviously I can't. I just want to stick to Islam. I want to stick to what I know. When I listen to very good people who want good things for everyone, who say, I'm a Muslim, I live by Islam, I live by Islamic Sharia, and the people who are doing the bad things, the people who are intolerant to women, intolerant to homosexuals, intolerant to Jews, intolerant to Christians, intolerant to Muslims, that don't abide by strict laws. The people who do that, the people who are intolerant, are not true Muslims. They don't understand Islam. They misinterpret it. What I do is simply look at, and I said this in my speech earlier tonight, in 2001, I adopted, Mosab, I'm looking at you, I adopted these ideas. I thought everybody who behaved badly and justified their bad behavior using Islamic doctrine was misinterpreting Islam. And then I went and started looking at, the man who walked me up into looking and checking these things off was Osama bin Laden after 9/11.
Pre-2001, many accepted they're misinterpreting Islam narrative. Then bin Laden forced us to actually read the sources, Qutb's milestones, al-Banna's Brotherhood Manifesto, Qaradawi's fatwas. These weren't misinterpretations, but mainstream Islamic scholarship. The violent jihadists quote the same text as the moderate scholars. They just take them more literally.
And he had all these citations, and the people he cited, Said Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, all these, again, let's not forget on the Shia side, Ayatollah Khomeini. These people are incredibly precise and learned in their interpretations. They take the Quran, they take the Hadith, and beyond. And so when I checked off, did Muhammad really say these things? Are these things really in the Quran? They were accurate. And I want to just remind you all of one thing. back then, when I was in the 1990s, I was living in the Netherlands, I was a translator and I was an interpreter. And you all live in Europe. And if you go to the European Union right now, you're going to get these little closets where translators and interpreters sit, and you're going to stick something in your ear. And if someone is translating in a way, or let's say if they're interpreting whatever the substance is, they'll be fired in a heartbeat. So as a translator, you are taught to do nothing other than convey the words that are being said. Stick to the substance, the real meaning. And if you go to the real meaning, the substance, you're going to walk away with things that all of us in this room find disturbing. And I'm looking at Daniel Pipes and I'm saying, yeah, look, there are so many good Muslims, wonderful Muslims, beautiful Muslims. In fact, I am of the opinion that most Muslims.
Professional translators face a dilemma: translate Islamic texts accurately and risk backlash, or sanitize the content for Western sensibilities. The uncomfortable truth is that the problematic passages are there in the original Arabic. No misinterpretation needed. Most Muslims are indeed peaceful people seeking normal lives, but that's despite, not because of, their religious texts.
They're just like us. They want to live in peace. They want to lead peaceful lives. This is all, it's a distraction to the way they want to live. And how are they best served? Because they're being challenged by members of their community who are saying, you cannot be a true Muslim unless you live according to the substance, the true meaning of what is there. Should we then say, well, you're confused to the Medina Muslim, to the person who's what you're seeing is not there? But we can't do that. Why cannot we do that? Because what Western liberal society prides itself on is we were like that as Christians and as Jews and as whatever. We had all our superstitions. We used to burn witches. We were as anti-Semitic as it gets. We had the Inquisition. We had all these terrible things. So what makes the history of Europe and the history of the Enlightenment different from the history of all of these other people in those contemporary times? It is that we got to a place where we said, actually, we are willing to face the truth in all its ugliness, in all its contortions. And based on what we see, we're going to either force ourselves to condone what we see or to condemn it. And if we condemn it, then we're going to move on and we're going to have alternatives. The Catholic Church had, up until the 1960s, an index of books that were prohibited.
Comparing medieval Christianity's evolution to modern Islam misses a crucial point. Western churches reformed because secular authority forced them to. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum ended in 1966, not through internal reform, but because society rejected religious censorship. Today's challenge isn't about waiting for Islamic reformation, it's about whether Western societies will maintain secular principles or accommodate religious demands that contradict fundamental human rights.
So if the continent of Europe was able to force the institution of the Catholic Church to be ashamed of the fact that they had such an index, what should our attitude be to the Islamists? It is to say, of course you have, this is the substance. These are the ideas you don't like. These are what you condemn. We have better ideas, and we're going to treat you in exactly the same way as we treated the Catholic Church. If we don't do that, we are guilty of the racism of law expectations.
Cheers to that. Advancing from what you've just said analyzing the text, maybe the Hadith and the Sirah. I'm particularly interested in your position in the, and I'm quoting here, stepping into the shoes of the devil's advocate, a professor of the University of Abuja in Nigeria. He said that in Islam, no authority forcibly constituted or acquired by power of swords or arms can have any legitimacy whatsoever. The institution of monarchy or military dictatorship did not exist during the time of the Prophet. They are subsequent developments and were legitimized by the fact that they had to prevent anarchy. And the institution of the monarchy actually crept in under Roman and Christian influence. What do you think of this? And what do you think of the development of Islam?
I think that's a beautiful apologetic. Blame the Romans for the troubles in Islam.
Because they are not here anymore.
Yeah. If it's not the British or the Americans or the Jews, it's the Romans. That's quite creative, I got to say. I haven't heard the Romans blamed for much for a while. There you go.
From Saudi's so-called progressive women driving laws to Britain's shadow Sharia courts, the panel exposed how religious absolutism fights secular freedom. While politicians champion voluntary arbitration, women face medieval rules in modern capitals. Their verdict: you can't vote on divine commands, and pretending otherwise just burns both democracy and reform.